I have a dream.
Love and care. We have.
Robinson gets the first hit.
Usain Bolt spreading.
Rid of all these buttons and just make a giant screen.
She lived among the brutalest and wickedest in history since the Dark Ages. The contrast between her and her century is the contrast of day and night. She was truthful when lying was the common speech of men. She was honest when honesty was a lost virtue. She was a keeper of promises when the keeping of a promise was expected of no one. She gave her great mind to great thoughts and great purposes when other great minds wasted themselves on pretty fancies and poor ambitions. She was modest and fine and delicate when to be loud and coarse might be said to be universal. She was full of pity when a merciless cruelty was the rule. She was steadfast when stability was unknown, and honorable in an age which had forgotten what honor was. She was a rock of convictions in a time when men believed in nothing and scoffed at all things. She was unfailing true in an age that was false to the core. She maintained her personal dignity unimpaired in an age of flattery and captivity. She was of a dauntless courage when hope and courage had perished in the hearts of her nation. She was spotlessly pure in mind and body when society in the highest places was foul in both. She was all of these things in an age when crime was the common business of lords and princes. A mere child in years, ignorant, illiterate, a poor village girl, unknown and without influence, found a great nation lying in chains, helpless and hopeless, bankrupt, all courage dead in the hearts of the people. And she laid her hand upon this nation, this corpse, and it rose and followed her. She led it from victory to victory and turned back the tide of war. And for all reward, the king stood by while priests took the noble child, the most innocent, the most lovely, the most adorable the ages have produced, and burned her alive at the stake. She is Joan of Arc.
Isn't it interesting how we all love a good story? You know, you hear this video and you hear of a story of a remarkable, even a glimpse of a remarkable life. There's something in our hearts that just gets inspired and ignited. And just out of curiosity, as we get started at all of our campuses today, if you prefer a great book over a great movie, will you raise your hand with me if you're like Mandy here and you're like, I love a great book, I'll get into it all day long. Okay, what about the opposite? If you love a great movie over a great book at all of our campuses, raise your hand. That's me. I agree with you. Here's a cool thing about stories. Stories like Joan of Arc, events, or even movies that we watch, there's something that is the same in almost every single one of them. The storyline is very similar in every story that inspires us. There is a hero with a problem, and he or she's going to overcome their obstacles to land on whatever it is that success looks like, to do something remarkable with their lives. And the reason why these movies and these stories inspire us so much is because whether you're a person of faith or not, even here at South Bay, I think we would agree that we have some desire inside of us, a part of our hearts that just wishes and longs to do something remarkable. We don't want our lives to just be wasted. We want our lives to count. And there's something inside of us that says, I want to be that person that overcomes the obstacle, to be the hero, to be courageous, or to just do something remarkable with our lives. The Bible is full of these type of stories. In fact, you might have heard of some of these already before. Stories like Moses, who with a staff opened the waters of a sea so that his people can come through in safety, and he rescued a whole nation. Stories like David, who defeated Goliath, a giant in his day that was torturing his people. Stories like Queen Esther, who rescued the Jewish people from slavery. But here's the problem with all of this. Sometimes we hear the stories, and we read the books, and we watch the movies, and those stories and those events get stuck in the pages of the book or on the screens that we watched it, and we don't know how to translate it into our lives and say, what does this look like for me? Could it be that the same God who parted the sea can part the waters of jealousy and pride in my life? And could it be that the same God who used David, this ordinary man, to defeat a giant, could he use me to defeat the giants in my life, in my marriage, in my work? Could it be that the same God who liberated the Jewish people through Esther could use us to liberate slavery and injustices in our day through us? But see, if God was big enough to do it then, isn't he big enough to still do it now? To use the ordinary people like you and I, for all of us, to do the remarkable, the extraordinary. So today we're going to take you on a journey through the life of Joan of Arc, and it's become very personal to Mandy and I. We've studied Joan of Arc now for 6 months, and it's become a part of our story now, and she's become like a close friend. We've cried over the story. We've stayed up late nights talking about her, and her life has so inspired us into courage that we're looking forward to sharing this with you. But here's the deal. Her story, like most remarkable lives, start out and has a lot of weird, crazy parts to it. And you see throughout our time together that that's actually a common part of people that live remarkably. But we're hoping that the story, though, ignites a passion and a courage inside of all of us here today, so that you would take this and apply it to every area of your life. So speaking of courage, this is Mandy's first time on stage with us, but I want to say proud of you for doing this. Take us into the story.
Yes, I need some courage today. So today we're going to go back over 600 years in the early 1400s in the country of France. Now, France and England had been at war for decades over who was the rightful heir to the throne in France. The history books would later refer to this time as the 100 Years' War, spanning a total of 116 years. You see, that's the world Joan of Arc was born into. In fact, not only was Joan born into a time of war, but so was her father and her grandfather. That means for 3 generations, they saw the world through the lens of war. Now, that's really difficult for us to relate to, but the closest I could come up with is that would be like the United States still fighting World War I, and we're losing. Now, despite the war, people adapt, and Joan grew up like that average poor village girl in the countryside village of Domremy in France, in the northeastern part of the country. She learned to sew and spin wool, and she would tend to the family garden. Joan never learned how to read. She never learned how to write, and as a child, she never even rode a horse. There was a church nearby Joan's family farm, and her mother would take her there every week for Mass. And Joan, as a young girl, grew to love going to church and learning about God. She would go there often by herself during the week just to pray all by herself. She could hear the church bells from her fields, and whenever she was out there, whether she was playing or working in the garden, she would stop and pray every time they rang. You see, even at a young age, Joan began connecting to the heart of God. When our hearts begin connecting with God, we align ourselves with them. And that's where remarkable courage begins. If you're taking notes, you might want to write this down. That remarkable courage begins by connecting to the heart of God. When our hearts are aligned with God's, we start to see the world through God's eyes, not just our own. The things that God is passionate about are the things that we get passionate about. So you may be sitting here today at our South San Jose campus, and your heart just burst when we're singing and worshiping through music this morning. That's your heart connecting to God's heart. Our hearts also begin to break over the things that break the heart of God. And you may be in Sunnyvale this morning, and you can no longer go to your cozy cubicles at work, knowing that there are women on the other side of the country who can't. You see, when our hearts are aligned with God's hearts, our lives become connected to His mission on this earth. Now, in just a minute, Filipe is going to share about what led Joan to this war. But before he does, I want to answer a question or talk about a question that I had to wrestle through in studying for this story. Why does this war even matter? And more importantly, why did God seem to care so much about it? Now, for the love of all the French press coffee, French tip manicures, and French fries in the world, I sure am thankful that France survived this ordeal. I could use some more French culture in my life. I don't know about you. But let's face it, the reasons for this war were nothing noble. It all stemmed from greed, power, nothing I would deem as righteous and saving. You see, I think I was looking at this situation kind of like a mom watching her kids fight over some insignificant toy or matter. You see, we have 5 kids at home, so we have no shortage of battles in our home on a regular hour-by-hour basis. And I have to pick and choose the battles I'm willing to get in the middle of and which ones I ask them to work out on their own. But it finally dawned on me. You see, there was nothing extra special about this war. This war wasn't that much different from wars past and wars since. But there was something different about this girl and her faith. See, the Bible says in 2 Chronicles 16, verse 9, that the eyes of the Lord are searching the whole earth in order to strengthen those who are fully committed to Him. And Joan was fully committed to God. And I believe God looked out over the country of France in the middle of a brutal war zone, and He saw a little girl with so much potential. He saw He could use her to do things that nobody else believed was possible. Her heart was becoming so aligned with God's heart, and God was going to use her to display His power. You see, the Bible is full of these stories. That's the kind of thing God does. And people were suffering throughout the country of France. That's why the war mattered. People were dying. People in Joan's village were dying. She saw it with her own eyes, and it broke her heart, and it broke the heart of God. You see, God is always on the side of the brokenhearted. If you're wondering where God is, that's where you can find Him. Isaiah 61, verse 1 says that He has sent me to comfort the brokenhearted and to proclaim that the captives will be released and prisoners will be freed. You see, God wasn't getting in the middle of this war because He cared more about France than England. He got in the middle of this war because He cared for those who were being treated unjustly. Most of the people in the country of France had given up. Most had gotten used to the suffering, but not Joan. Here, this poor girl broke over the suffering of her people, and God was about to use her to show His power and His love for those same people. You see, God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He doesn't change. So the same God who looked out over France in 1428 and saw the suffering throughout the country, He looks out over the world today, and He sees the suffering that's going on today. And His heart breaks over it. So my question for us this morning is, do our hearts break over it? Are we broken over the injustices in our world, or have we just gotten used to them? We've seen terrorist attack after attack after attack. Is it just the way life is? The only thing we or anyone we know has ever known? Maybe you're sitting here this morning in our North San Jose campus, and you have been suffering abuse for 3 generations. It's all you or your family have ever known. Have you just accepted it? Is it normal to see children without homes or families to live in? Are we broken over the poor in our neighborhoods? Is it okay to us that racism is still prevalent in our country today? Let's not be a community of people who just accept these things because it's all we've ever known. Let's begin to respond and connect to God's heart and have his heart for the brokenness in our world today.
So that's what began to happen. They didn't clap for me. Sunnyvale, I hope you clap for her too. That's what began to happen to Joan. She saw the brokenness of a people, and the heart of God was breaking for them, so her heart began to break for them also. Because when we respond to the heart of God, when we have his heart, the things that break his heart begin to break ours. So she saw a people and she said, this is not okay. This is not okay for me to go on and pretend like everything is okay. And at the age of 13 years old, some strange things began to happen with Joan. I think it was part of what Mandy said, God looking over this nation or the world, and he's trying to find somebody whose heart is leaning toward him. And then he sent angels to speak to her. And I know what you're thinking, angels speaking to a young 13-year-old girl in France is kind of strange. And yes, it is. But here's the deal. Angels are real. They're not some force out in the universe or ghosts that kind of fly around our houses. They have names and personalities and purposes. And part of their mission on the earth is to be messengers of God to the world. Sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't, but they are active in the lives of humans. But the point in all of it is this, that God speaks. And he's speaking over and over and over again. We see this in Scripture. In fact, an angel appeared to Mary, and the very event that defines the faith of those of us that call ourselves Christians that whole event was started by an angel speaking to a young girl. God spoke through Peter and through Paul, and all throughout history, he speaks through dreams and visions and circumstances and promptings in our hearts and emotions. God still speaks. But maybe the reason why God spoke to Joan through the angel is because she was illiterate. She didn't have the ability to open the Word of God and to read it on her own. But God knew that her heart was positioned to listen. So he sent an angel to her, and she began to hear their voices and speak to them, physical form of angel. Joan was visited by angels so much in her teenage years that it became normal to her. Now, I know that for those of you that are non-Christians or even some Christians in the room, the idea of God speaking is kind of strange. And if those of you that are Christians, maybe you're used to saying things like God told me yesterday that today I was going to do this, or God told me that I need to move across the world and go do whatever it is that God told you to do. And maybe that's common to you, but that's some strange stuff. Like when you're not used to this type of language, and you can relate with me, those of you that are kind of newer in faith, and someone says, God spoke to me and said this, it is strange. But here's the truth about all of this. See, Jesus himself, he was speaking of this kind of truth, of God speaking to us. He says he's like the shepherd, and we are the sheep. And he said this is how he treats or what he does with the flock. The scriptures in John chapter 10, it says this, after he gathered his flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. See, a distinctive factor in the life of those that follow Jesus is their ability to hear the voice of God and to do something about it. That's what started to happen with her. See, remarkable courage begins by connecting to the heart of God, but it continues as we act on the promptings of God. And see, the prompting of God comes in a lot of different ways. You might have a sense inside of you. It might be something that makes you have tension or passion or tears, and you watch something and it just ignites emotion inside of you. A lot of different ways to receive the prompting. But once we connect with the heart of God, we start to receive these promptings, the voice of God speak to us, and it's our job then to do something about it. But here's the truth. When you start acting on the promptings, most of the time, people will think you're crazy. They'll laugh at you. They'll say, you're out of your mind. It happened to Jesus. It happened to his followers. And it's happened to every generation of believer, because remarkable things don't usually start off sounding remarkable. They start out sounding crazy, sometimes even foolish. For those of us in Silicon Valley, you might have remembered when Steve Jobs first came on that stage and he said, hey, I'm going to put all of our media into one device and call it an iPhone. And people thought he was crazy. But now everybody's got one in their pocket. When Stephen Curry was in high school, and he is a little kid, skinny, and he starts to work double the amount that all his other playmates would work, and he started to stay after and practice hours after hours with a dream to be in the NBA, though he was too small for high school, too weak for college, and never was going to be able to be in the NBA in people's minds. They thought he was crazy, but I don't think they think that he's crazy anymore. In fact, I'm looking forward to some Warriors this week. Anybody else? You see, when you tell your friends that you have this prompting from God to go move across the country and do something significant, or to use your career to tackle a cause in the world, or whatever it might be, they'll think you're crazy. If you remember, Mandy, even for us, when we had the prompting to adopt two kids, when we already had 3, how many people looked at us and said, you guys are out of your mind? And then I said, I think we're out of our mind. Because when you hear the prompting of God in your life, it doesn't usually sound like a remarkable thing. It sounds like a foolish thing. But when you take steps forward, remarkable things begin to happen. You see, this is what happened to Joan. Joan grew accustomed to their voices. They started to give her information. And then she knew that she had to do something about it. So one day, Joan was 16 years old. The angel Michael came up to her and said this to her: God has chosen you to lead the armies of France and overturn this war. She's an uneducated, poor little girl, a teenage girl, and she's got a message from an angel that she's going to lead an army. She's never ridden a horse before. She doesn't know what she's doing, but she began to act on the promptings of God. She knew she had to go meet with the king to get this done, because the king would appoint her to be the general of the army. So she went to her governor and said, hey, governor, God told me that I'm going to lead the armies of France, and we're going to put an end to this war that's been going on for 3 generations, and I'm it. So he laughs at her, as you can imagine, and he thinks she's crazy. But after a while, he started to realize, how does this girl know the future? Because see, her voice, the voice of God through the angels, would tell her what was going to happen before it actually happened. And so he thought, you know what, we've got nothing to lose. We've tried already 3 generations worth of grown men trying to end this war. What do I have to lose by letting a little teenage girl give it a try? So he sends her out to meet with the king. And in 1429, the impossible began to happen. Joan appeared at a city called Chinon, I believe. The French people tried to teach me the name, but it was hard. But she appears before the king, has a private conversation with him, and he is amazed at the courage of this young girl. And I think maybe just because he had no other hope at this point, he appointed her to lead the armies of France. So there she goes, and her reputation begins to grow in the whole entire country. She becomes known as the young warrior girl who's leading armies of grown men that up to this point were just full of fear. They were not able, in fact, when the English armies were coming over their towns, they would just retreat. But now she started to win battles, and she won one of her first battles, now known as the Battle of Orleans, which turned the war around. Here's the crazy thing, though. See, she was just ordinary, but she had remarkable courage, and she didn't do things in an ordinary way. In fact, she didn't even kill with her sword. This whole time leading the armies, she never killed one person. Because you see, remarkable courage begins when we connect with the heart of God. And the heart of God is always for people, not against them. God breaks over every kind of brokenness of every race, of every injustice in every place around the world. When there is injustice, God is near to that place. And so her heart begins to break for them. But not only that, when we break for the things that break the heart of God, we have to act on the promptings of God, and it's always consistent with his heart. So this is what we see in her. She was relentless about the mission that God gave her. She believed in it so much that she was the first one to get up, the last one to leave the field. She began to lead these armies of men, and she actually taught them to not cuss. And now if you are in a military family, you know that's like an impossible. That alone should prove to you she was from God. Because she was leading an army of men that could not cuss. They had such an honor for her name that when she would show up, many of them would bow before her because of her courage of this young girl that alone was now leading armies of grown people to take battle. She would lead so differently that every day she would start the day by taking communion. She was reminding herself of what Jesus did on the cross, of his blood and his body broken for us. And she knew that that was done because he cares for people so much that it's worth it for you to sacrifice all you have for this cause. There were moments where she was hurt and pierced with an arrow on her shoulder, and she kept on fighting. Though the men said, take a break. She said, no, I'm going to be up front, and I'm going to lead the way for us. When her enemies would get hurt, she would literally come off her horse and pray for the wounded and then heal their wounds. She was a warrior with a heart that was remarkable. And her name now, 600 years later, is still talked about because she inspired a whole nation because of her courage. People responded very similarly to the followers of Jesus in the first century. When they were filled with the Spirit of God, just like Joan was, they went into the towns proclaiming the message of Jesus with such courage that people were amazed. There was an instance in Acts chapter 4 that says the members of the council of the city were amazed when they saw the courage of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men. They also recognized that they were men that had been with Jesus. You see, when you get the heart of Jesus and you act on the promptings that he gives you, something starts to stand out about our lives. And what is it for you? What's that prompting, that sense, that passion, that desire that God's put inside of you that maybe you've kind of let it be dormant, but like Joan, you have a choice now to say, I'm going to start putting some action on this prompting and see what God might do.
Now, after about a year of constant victory after victory after victory, Joan is captured. And she had been warned by an angel that she would be, but she didn't know when, and she didn't know what would happen to her afterward. Eventually, Joan was sold to the English, who then gave her over to the priests to be tried for heresy. After all, she claimed to hear the voice of God, and that was a dangerous claim for a poor, illiterate girl to make. Joan was charged with 70 accounts, including witchcraft and hearing evil spirits. You see, these priests, who were politically motivated, they felt so threatened by Joan and her courage and her bold faith that they were willing to do whatever was necessary to silence her. During her trial, she consistently responded with humility, wisdom, and even great respect for the men who were questioning her. Over 60 priests sat, treating her with contempt. And one account describes it like this: there she stood, starving and answering everybody, always bravely, always courteously, always wisely, and sometimes even merrily. They kept asking her the same questions on different days to try to make her vary in her answers. She never did. This went on for 5 months. And after about a year of the imprisonment and months of questioning, the priests finally realized they were going to have to do some dramatic display to get rid of her. So they took her out behind the church into a graveyard, and they had built 2 large platforms where one side all the priests were, one all the dignitaries. And in the middle, they put a stake roaring with fire. There the priest had prepared a confession form, declaring that the voices she was hearing was not, in fact, God's voice. All she had to do was sign her name, and she would be spared her life. As Joan's 19-year-old eyes gazed into that fire, fear overcame her, and she relented, and a priest guided her in signing her name. back in the tower, Joan was in chains. And there God came and spoke to her once again. And Joan felt so guilty and convicted for trying to save her life. And he came and encouraged her, comforted her, and she realized her fate. When her guards came back and they asked her if she had heard the voice of God again, she declared, "Yes, I did. And I'm sorry that I've ever denied it. It was the fear that made me do it," she said. Upon her confession, Joan was sentenced to be burned. You see, remarkable courage endures no matter the cost. Now, courage is a whole lot of fun to talk about when we're winning, right? Until someone has to die for it. But can we still sing "You Make Me Brave" when we're facing the fire? Most of us in this room aren't going to face a physical fire, but we will, whether we're Christian or not, face difficulties in our life. You may be in here this morning, and you recently received a cancer diagnosis, or a friend did, or a spouse walked out on you. How do we respond in the face of difficulty? My life group last fall was studying the book of Daniel right as I came across the story of Joan. In fact, we were reading Daniel chapter 3 the same week. And it's the story of the 3 Hebrew men who faced the fire. And in that story, King Nebuchadnezzar had built a giant golden statue. And he had commanded everyone at certain times of the day, when the music played, to bow down and worship it. Those who didn't would be thrown into the fire. And sure enough, when the music played, these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow. And when the king approached them and they asked, "Why didn't you bow?" this was their response in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. "King Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to defend our actions in this matter. We are ready for the test. If you throw us into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is able to rescue us from a furnace of blazing fire and release us from your power. But even if he does not, you can be sure, O king, that we still will not serve your gods and will not worship the golden statue." The faith of these 3 men is so strong, they are willing to face the fire. They didn't know that they would be rescued. I imagine myself in that scenario alone, and I want to say that my faith is strong enough to make for that test, to stand. But I don't know. The fear alone could bring me to my knees. I've never been there before. Fear is a physical response to real and immediate danger. That's why acts of torture work so well. The human body and will struggles naturally to stand up to it. It gives me a little hope for this story, and that's why I left it in here, that initially Joan caved to the fear. It gives us a window that this was still a 19-year-old girl. As much as she had been with God, physically seen an angel, she still was overcome with fear in the face of suffering. You see, the goal here is not to want to suffer. That's not what I'm trying to get anyone to say today. The goal is to be willing to. And there's a huge difference, because there are some evil people in the world who get a thrill out of watching suffering. We saw it this week in Manchester, and it's heartbreaking. You see, that's not from God. God doesn't get a thrill out of watching people suffer. It reminds me of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And right before he was taken to the cross, Scripture in Luke 22 describes the scene as he was overcome with so much anguish, he was sweating drops of blood. You see, even Jesus himself did not want to suffer, but he was willing to. We all want a story like Joan's. I don't know about you. The first part, We all want stories told of us where we're heroes and we rescue and save the people who need saving. We just don't want to have to risk it all to get it. You see, I want the beginning of Joan's story, but I don't want the end of it. I have a feeling that's most of us here today. I want a faith, though, that's so strong, I'm willing to face the fire, even if it costs me everything, and even if I'm standing alone. Imagine the scene with me. On May 30th, in 2 days, it's the anniversary, 1431, Joan of Arc, surrounded by 800 soldiers to keep her or anyone from rescuing her, and behind them, thousands of people. She walked willingly to the stake. They placed a paper cap on her head that read, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, and idolatrous." And she asked a priest to hold up a cross for her to look at while she burned. And as she walked up to that fire and the fire started, she wasn't looking down. She was looking up at the cross. And it said, while she was in the fire, she called loudly on the name of Jesus. And when the end came, she bowed her head and released her spirit, crying, "Jesus."
And Jesus was there. He was really close because he is where people of his heart are giving of themselves for the mission. And sometimes you look at her life and you say, man, it was cut short. But here's the truth. It is not how many years that you live. It's how you live your years. You see, you're not too young or too old or too inexperienced or too unknown to live a remarkable life. Because remarkable courage starts with our hearts connecting with his so that we break over the things that break his heart. But then it continues as we act on these promptings that he gives us. We start serving in the area of our passion, and we start to take steps forward in solving problems that burn inside of our heart. But then we have to choose, will we endure to the very end? You see, Joan is still talked about 600 years later because of this kind of courage. Her life reminds us though you might start young and you might feel too old, or that you might feel that you don't have what it takes, that God can take our willing hearts and do something remarkable with it as we step forward in courage. Without her, friends would have probably not existed, or at least for hundreds more years, or hundreds and thousands more people would have suffered without this young little girl. As the bands come up at all of our campuses, I want to ask you some questions to just have you internalize and process what this means to you and I. You see, what is the injustice that burns inside of your heart? Like, what is that thing, that passion, that emotion that just brings emotion and feelings and anxiety sometimes, or tension out of you when you see it? What is the injustice that's burning in you that God's saying, you need to do something about this? You see, it's always consistent with the heart of God. And sometimes you look at your coworkers and you're just broken at the fact that they don't know God yet. And he's saying, it's time for you to have some courage. Those of you that are in middle school, maybe God's asking you to say, you know what? It's time for you, though there might not be anybody else of faith in your school, for you to step up in courage and be the one that makes a change in your class. Maybe God's asking you to follow the prompting of leading a life group and influencing people around you, or to start serving in the area that you burn with passion, or maybe to use your company for a greater cause than what you're using it now for. Maybe it's the courage to surrender to Jesus today. And you've heard this message and you know that Jesus has been calling you and he's been prompting thoughts inside of you and drawing you to himself, but you haven't said yes yet. And this is the moment to say yes to Jesus. Whatever you say, Jesus, it's a yes for me. Sometimes it's the courage to forgive, or to empty a bank account for a cause that you believe in, to foster a child that doesn't have a home, to share your faith in a bolder way because people far from God break his heart, because he wants all people to be near to him. And He's looking throughout the earth, and He's looking throughout our campuses right now. And He's trying to see which of the hearts here are the ones that will lean toward me. Where are the Joans in the room, the young girls who have something burning inside of them that says, I want to make a difference with my life. And I'm willing to connect with the heart of God. And I'm willing to do what He says and follow His promptings. And I'm willing to endure no matter who says I'm crazy and I'm foolish for what I'm about to do. I'm going to take some steps forward. See, that's the calling that He gives to us. I want to ask all of our campuses to stand together for a minute and just close your eyes. I'm going to read to you a quote from Joan of Arc, and then we're going to say a blessing over each one of us and then sing a song. And during this time, I want to ask you to just really internalize what God's saying to you. What's the application for your heart? Joan once said this: one life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it. But to sacrifice what you are and to live without belief, that's a fate more terrible than dying. See, God's calling us to a mission. And He's looking at our hearts right now, and He's saying, would you lean it toward me and take steps of courage? This Franciscan blessing goes like this: may God bless you with discomfort at easy answers and half-truths and superficial relationships so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger and injustice, oppression and exploitation of people so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. And may God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, and starvation and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world so that you can do what others claim cannot be done.